your network connection drops out or anything, then you might lose it. So.
Yeah.
Also,
I have this little, I have this little problem.
You'll have to upload it later.
Yeah. I have this little problem.
Sorry, I realized.
Sorry.
I was saying I was double muted, but yes, you want to record in the cloud, and then this will be included in the batch upload of recordings to YouTube at the beginning of next week, so that it will be public for everyone.
All right, thanks. Yeah, and yours truly could actually fall off the call. I have this little problem, which is my laptop might explode. That's another story. All right. So why don't we go ahead and get started? It's well past 5 past the hour, and it's late. First, thanks everybody for joining. It's particularly difficult for a good number of people, equally convenient or inconvenient for many. So thanks for taking this discussion. Before we go too much further, a reminder. I think everybody on this call has not only seen this slide, but I think nearly everybody has presented this slide. We have a fairly good set of veterans in the group. Therefore, I assume that everybody is familiar with it, and I won't spend any more time on it. Are there any questions? Okay, then moving on. The program's being run, very much like a working group. We'll have a very working groupish feel to it. Minutes are being taken. We're doing our work mostly on the mailing list, and we're doing a call. I'm varying that a little bit in terms of how to proceed in discussions. Not dramatically. And I think as we move on, as we start to do document development, it's going to feel pretty much like a working group. So part of that, of course, as everybody here knows, is when we get to the agenda slide, the first thing we do is bash the agenda. I want to just go through this very quickly. I want to do just a brief program introduction review for people who haven't been following the mailing list day to day. I wanted to talk a little bit about the poll that was taken, and then we'll get on to discussion points based on the poll, and then any other business. Before I proceed any further, I want to highlight, you see the third sub-bullet on discussion point is RFC editor qualities. I put that there because in looking at like the most interesting things to people to discuss, at a high level, that was sort of one of the top 10, and I tried to organize issues around that. Before I go any further, do people have any concerns, or would they like to bash the agenda, or shall we proceed? Okay. Then we'll proceed. Just some basic housekeeping. First of all, I'd like to thank Cindy and the tools team, and I presume, Russ, you had something to do with this, that now we have a data tracker page. That's not quite on these slides yet, but it will be on the next batch. Thanks to all the people who did the work on that.
That was Robert.
That was Robert, okay. Please pass along the thanks of the chair and hopefully everybody who's on the call as well. So that we'll use that, and it's more of evidence that we'll try and run this, pretty much as a working group. But not all programs will, but this one will. So there's also, obviously, I think everybody's on the mailing list. You've seen the charter. We have this lovely little GitHub area. We're not necessarily using it in its fullest capacity at the moment. I presume as we get going a little further, there'll be issues and things that need to be tracked, and GitHub is particularly good for that. Let's see here. This is right out of the charter, right? So we have, I just want to go over this for a moment. Our purpose is to really discuss potential changes to the RFC editor model, and the RFC and how the editor functions to be managed, staffed, and overseen, and that's all within scope. And then we'll output some documents as we get going. Now, this is just a snippet from the program charter. Where we have a pretty free hand as a group, as can be seen here. Amongst other things, we might need to, at some point or another, form with questions, maybe to help develop text. I presume there'll be some editors who rise to the challenge of trying to work with updating a process that a lot of us have deep feelings about. So again, it'll all feel very working like. The work program, I've sort of simplified it out, right, which is to seek agreement on what problems to solve them. And this is sort of where we are. And you know, your humble chair has been mostly sitting back the last couple of days, and very much enjoying the back and forth that's been going on. And greatly appreciative to Brian for having put out a document that has spurred discussion and helped us, I think, focus quite a ways. Now, there was a poll topics to talk about today. Now, I must admit, an agenda in terms of wanting to have a call like this, which is so that people can actually hear each other's views and maybe have a little bit of clarification, so that people where people sit, and that there's a general feel for where the issues are in terms of things that we will find both agreement and disagreement. So that's one of the reasons I thought it would be useful to get to this point, and why I'm talking about it with this slide, so that we can make sure we can sort of try and, over the next weeks, maybe a month or two, to try and close out, you know, what it is, the problems that we're trying to solve, and then go and solve them. Regarding the survey, you know, I put together, you know, I put together that survey. I think many of you, 14 of you, participated in it. And by the way, this is my last slide. We're going to come back to the key points. We might even stick on this slide, and we might vary a little bit. I'm allowed for the idea that we might bash the agenda a bit at some point again. But I noticed that they're pretty much at the what rose to the top were 3 high-level points. The first, where I think a lot of people focused down on, was what are the roles, what is their relationship to one another, and obviously I think that ties directly to the charter. If we solve this top problem, right, if we were able to do a decent job of this one, I think we would really have done a good day's work, maybe a good year's work. What do we want from the series? We had some discussion about that, and people, I think, believe, and I know that some people believe strongly, that we need some form of a mission statement relating to the series. The third bullet was then around RFC editor qualities. I would say that that third bullet really does tie to the discussion that we've been having, and particularly when we talk about authority. Well, you have to be competent to exercise that authority, and so what competencies do you need? So these are the sort of the high-level points, and I figured we'd spend a fair amount of time, you know, again, mostly talking about these 2 points. I'm not really too fussed about which order we tackle them in, but I think it sounds like we should probably at least get on the table if people have views about that they want to express about what do they want from the series, right? I think that's probably the right place to start. It was actually sort of top of the pops in terms of the poll. So what I'm going to propose is, I'm going to just take this out of presenter mode so I can see the list of people. And just, I haven't been following the chat, and I apologize if people have been commenting and wanting to make comments. Before I go on, do people want to comment about any of the slides that I presented or the way to go forward here? Okay, I'm getting a thing here that said John wants to annotate. Okay, John, let's not make a big doodle of this, but if you have something you want to do.
If I'm using an unfamiliar computer and I pushed the wrong button. Sorry.
Oh, okay. All right, very good. Best possible answer there, John. So, again, if there's no comments, what I'm going to do is just invite people at this point just to talk about. Oops, now I'm doodling. Oh, we're having one of those WebEx moments. How do I stop it? Just a second. I'm just going to. Oh, here it is. Annotations. There we go. I think it all went away. So I'll invite people just to talk a little bit about what they see as the vision for this series. What does it look like 50 years from now? What's important to you about the series that the RFC series editor needs to take to heart and is core to the role of the RFC series editor. So who would like to start? Well, I mean, I guess I'm going to actually say if nobody wants to talk to that. Oops, do I hear? John, do you want to make a comment or do you want to mute? Okay. If this could be an awfully short meeting, if people have no comments on these topics, in which case we'll get to any other pretty quickly. Is that Larry?
Yeah, that was me. Seems like there are a lot of people on the call haven't quite figured out what the interface is. We were talking. The thing that concerns me is that the RFC series fit into the rest of the world, which has standards from multiple organizations. And these other organizations are kind of changing the way they're doing business. And I'd just like to see the IETF series adapt to the evolving world, and the V3 XML was an attempt to do that maybe wasn't quite as successful as people had hoped.
Okay.
There's a lot more that needs to make it. And I was trying to figure out who's responsible for the liaison between IETF and other SCOs as far as their needs for our series and vice versa.
Okay. Other comments? I see, Doug, you have your hand up. Is that right? Okay, we can't hear you if you're trying to talk.
Yeah, so what do I want from the RFC series? I'm going to take the position of an academic today because I'm not sure that many other academics are there. I've seen Colin. When we look at publication venues, I see Brian is here too. When we look at publication venues, then one thing, of course, is something that can be summarized as reputation, and I don't want to go into all the details of that. But just one aspect of reputation that has received a lot of attention recently is the foundations or guidelines for good scientific practice. So that may not be something that is close to the heart of everyone in this meeting, but it's maybe a good example for why a particular set of stakeholders or a particular stream might have specific requirements here that traditionally an editor was the person who held them up.
Okay. Brian? And good morning to you.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you for this very convenient meeting time, by the way. Perfect. I just wanted to say I'm paying a lot of attention to what people are saying, and I'm going to try and put stuff into my draft when I revise it next week, because there's been an awful lot of stuff written between the lines, I think, in some of the comments that I've got, but I haven't had many comments that are really directly saying this sentence should say that instead. Right? So I'd ask people to do that by email, not necessarily on the WebEx, but send me real concrete actionable suggestions and I can put them in. And if there are alternative suggestions, I can put the alternatives in, right? So we can see them in a document like an issues list. So that's really all I wanted to say right now.
Okay. All right, and at some point we'll probably end up. We'll have to figure out what to do with your draft over time, Brian. I don't think the goal is to to try and rush into solutions engineering, and I don't think your draft does that, by the way. But we'll have to try to evolve towards that over time.
I think John Clenson has his hand up as well, by the way.
John, go ahead.
Elliot, I hope I won't get cut off because WebEx is, for some reason, periodically freezing my machine, and this is the third time it's done that this week. So it's not just this call. I'm concerned about our going down rat holes. I'm having trouble engaging a little bit with your list, unlike Brian's document, which I have tried looking at and responding to, although I note his comment. But if we start talking about liaisons with organizations or solving problems, which it seems to me are very low priority, we're going to end up on rat hole tours. And I can certainly understand and very sympathetic with trying to get a grip on what we wanted the series 50 years out. But the IETF community and the internet community generally have been pretty poor at predicting 10 years out. So I'm worried about how we get a little more focus on this. I'm worried about how we do this either explicitly addressing the modern living document versus archival standards and things that procurement people can use. Questions, we should either try to tackle those head on or try to push them out of the way. And a series of other things like that. And as I have tried fairly unsuccessfully to follow the list over the last several weeks, it feels like we're hitting some important points, but then going around in circles on it. And I don't know how to get out of that, how to suggest getting out of that pattern.
Okay. Point well taken. We definitely, I think nobody would deny that we do get into the weeds. I think I'll add, if I may, that I think at the beginning of these sorts of efforts, one does tend to land in the weeds a little bit, and it's good to back up and make sure that we're hitting the high points as you pointed out. I do think something like what we want out of the series ties to our work, but I just want to read out what Doug said in case people are following the chat. So he said, as a user of the series, I'd like the future to categorize sets of RFCs. Just a few examples would be email SMT, VoIP, DNS, so that people can navigate more complex ones that have a larger number of RFCs. One question I have for the group is, who gets to decide this vision, right? Is it how is that? Yes, and in fact, I think if I understand, Stephen is actually asking the exact same question that I'm asking. Does anybody else have a comment they want to make on that point, or others, or would people like to focus on the first question, which I think is perhaps where people are sort of interested in going?
Elliot, just on the second, and noting Russ's comment about whether this is for us or for an RFC, to a certain extent, the question that Doug raises gets tied up with the questions of who has the authority to do that kind of reorganization and classification, and the position long ago was what brought us to New Track, and that spectacular failure about, from my point of view, exactly the kinds of organizational documents that Doug is talking about, because these organizational things are ultimately judgment calls. And at least for the IETF stream, the IASG has taken the position that that's an IETF problem and not an RFC problem. And I think they're right.
So when you say they're right, just so that we're clear, you're right. They're right that the organizational problem is that how it's not the classifications themselves aren't an organizational problem. That could almost be there's a relationship there between that and what the RSC has to actually do to help that organization. How do you separate?
Well, I first of all, I'm not sure I know, but I noticed that when we look at things like email SMTP and probably VoIP and definitely DNS, there are questions about what belongs in that category and what doesn't belong in that category. Now, you can solve those problems after a fashion by permitting things to be in multiple categories, but the more categories you put them in, the less useful the categorization gets. And that's where these things belong together and those things don't, is ultimately substantive technical matter.
Does anybody else want to comment on this topic here before we press on?
I just wanted to address something that came to mind about separation of the metadata from the document. It's right now when RFCs are retrieved, you only get the document, you don't get any of the metadata. And some of the problems that we've had with categorization that need to adapt to the perspective of the time that happened in the metadata that was updatable versus the standard, which is not. That kind of change should be in scope for the RFC editor to manage.
Okay, one of the points that was made, I think it was Mark Nottingham who made it, but I may be wrong, was that one of the things we want out of an RFC editor is to help make the series navigable. It might have been Neville too who raised that, but is that something that is the responsibility of the RFC, or is that something that's the responsibility of the streams? Go back to John's point. Maybe it's a question we can't answer, but today, and maybe it's one we don't want to answer, by the way, but it was asked. All right, any other comments on this topic from people who have? So the other point that I think we heard, with the poll was that these questions were if you will, in your top 3 choices, in terms of percentages. So what roles are defined? What is their relationship to one another? And I've sort of grouped the other questions where it seemed to make sense, right? These were all slightly different takes on or with a little bit more specificity on this question. And so what I'd like to do is invite people to talk to how they view the role of the RSC in relation to the other bodies and groups of people, including the community in general, and to take a stab at these sorts of issues as to what you think are the important ones, where you see some problems, and maybe where you see that we need to take this effort. Would anybody like to comment on that point? Okay, we're definitely going to run out of agenda items really soon, and I'll probably have to try a different tact in terms of these meetings as they go forward. If people don't feel that they'd like to comment in these points. So sort of last call if you'd like to talk about it, any of these components. Okay. Well, if people don't feel comfortable talking about these things, let me turn to any other business. And how would people like to use the time both on the list and let me just ask a question. Do people like the organization that they see here? Would you like to turn to RFC editor qualities? Because I didn't ask that question. I'll open the floor. Would anybody like to comment either on how this is organized, or how or the RFC editor qualities, or would you like to, for instance, turn to Brian's draft and talk a little bit about that as part of any other business? And I see, Brian, you have your hand up.
I didn't think I had my hand up.
Okay.
Neville here. I'm wondering whether it'd be good to talk about what we're looking for in the way of an RFC editor, and in particular to maybe poke a bit at the question of what's the important thing for the series, really. There's been a lot of discussion about it. The historical record as compared to being a newspaper editor and things like that, which, although it was intriguing, did indeed seem to have a life of its own, didn't seem to get anywhere. In other words, where do we see the series going?
Do you have a view?
Well, one of the things which Heather put a lot of time into was thinking about the archiving and the whole question of never mind XML. If we're going to be really serious about it, the digital preservation side of it, then we have to be able to reconstruct the document years hence. But there were one or two comments that I've seen in an email a little while back of people using RFCs saying it was wonderful that they could go back 50 years and see what people were thinking back then. And that was what I meant by the archival record. So I'm interested in what is it that we see as being really important for the series, and maybe that'll help us try and get at what sort of person the RFC editor has to be.
Does anybody have any comments in addition to that, on top, in response to Neville's point?
Elliot, I may be the only one, but the reason why I'm not commenting on a lot of this isn't because I'm too shy to speak up. as you probably all know. But because I find it much easier to try to think through these things and analyze and write than to try to respond on topics this general on a real-time voice conversation. That would even be true if we were face to face, but it's a little worse here. And I don't know if others are having that problem or not. When we get down to very specific things, it's a little different. But even Neville's question is pretty general for me to figure out how to respond to in a broad and yet specific way.
Okay, I could see that, and I see that there's an active dialogue going on actually on chat. I don't know if anybody wants to bring that forward, but we can. If people feel the same as John, we can keep this call short. And everybody else get on with their day.
This is Brian. Can I say something there?
Sure.
I think through a lot of the discussion, it's been often very unclear whether people actually wanted to discuss a topic that John raised earlier, which is what's wrong with the IETF standards process, and confusing that discussion with what's wrong with the RFC series, if you like. And I think for the purposes of this group and its mandate, it's very important to say we are not fixing the IETF standards process. If that's a problem, the IETF, which is not this meeting, should go away and fix that problem, and then come back and tell us if that puts any new requirements on the RFC series.
Okay, it's a good point to make, right, in terms of scoping. Mike, good afternoon.
Hey there. As I was listening to this, one of the things that I realized is that there's a couple goals that we ought to have that nobody has actually stated. And one is not to have to do this again in 10 years. So coming up with a structure or model that that works and that changes gradually over time rather than as say a subset of the leadership changes would be one of my derived goals for this process. With respect to RFC editor qualities versus everything else, well, it's hard to have RFC editor qualities unless you know what we want from the series itself. And again, if this is just a place to park documents after they've been edited someplace else, and we need a little bit of help of getting them in the appropriate format, then the RFC editor quality is a project manager. I think Doug mentioned that comment on there. Whereas if we're looking for someone to represent the series and basically, if you will, be its advocate within the IETF community, that's a whole different set of things. So I don't know where to set that right now. And I think I mentioned I was actually concerned about trying to do the teleconference because I didn't think we were to the point of getting things crisp enough to have a discussion on a particular question. So.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. Other comments, maybe along those lines, or?
Yeah, this is Wes. I think one of the things that I keep watching in the discussions that go on the mailing list is we have sort of, a short-term problem or a short-term goal of, we need to get somebody in place, and that's been a goal stated by a lot of people. And we fortunately have a wonderful volunteer that has stepped in the interim, but the goal has been to get somebody in place as quickly as possible. And yet at the same time, we are discussing very long-term, topics of what do we want in the series, and, how do we want management and oversight to happen. And unfortunately, those longer-term discussions, which I absolutely agree, I think this group, if we want to take on that level of planning and thought, needs to be done carefully. And Mike's comment about this needs to last beyond 10 years is spot on. How do we fix the short-term problem without spending a long time on the long-term goals? So I would love to hear people's thoughts on what's the right roadmap forward? What things should we tackle immediately, then tackle the longer term, and then maybe come back to re-architect what we did first? I don't know the answer to that, but we do seem to be having a bipolar position to some extent.
Is that, I mean, is this something that other people on the IAB feel as well, in terms of they really want to get somebody in place, and they also want to, is that common within the IAB in particular?
Not at all, not at all. That's my personal view on things. I mean, as I think, I hope that the IAB has made clear. You'll notice that I'm not inserting my own opinion into most of the points that I raise, bringing up to the list. We really want to be hands off. This is the community's decision to a large extent. We are here to facilitate, help, and everything else, but it's not our goal to do any sort of direction. That's why we have wonderful chairs that are not part of. We will have wonderful chairs that are not part of the IAB. So our goal is not to be intimately involved. I do ask questions though about what does the group want and what do we want. There's already been a discussion earlier in the slides about what's in scope, and Stephen even quoted part of it in the dialogue going by of. It's designed to be, I don't want to say unlimited, but to a large extent, if the group thinks it needs to take on anything, we believe that there are priorities or things that need to be dealt with. The fact that we are missing a long-term RFC at the moment is I think a problem that I believe everybody believes is something that we ought to fix. And it's hard to create a plan to get out of the pickle at the same time as do the long right-term planning.
Okay, thanks. Let me just ask a question about the poll in this, rather the slide that you have in front of you. Are these pretty good questions that we have in front of us? Like in particular in terms of the role, and in terms, I mean, I think the what do we want from the RFC series is a bit open-ended. To really sink one's teeth into, and I think that's the problem that Mike sees with that, and I think John, in terms of your comments as well. But are the questions that I put up there, which are really your questions, I just reordered them a little bit and summarized a little bit. Are these the right questions that we need to be asking? Are these good starting points for even people writing down their ideas and trying to address these points?
Hi, this is John, buddy.
Jared, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I figured I'd try and do the IETF, the virtual thing, since we got to practice for Madrid as well. I think, for me, I see these as the right questions. I agree. I think, and that's of course in a personal role and capacity. I think there's a lot of questions here, whether or not we just want, what people have said in some of the comments of, do we want somebody who's just an XML expert? Do we want somebody who's an expert in publishing the tools? Or do we want somebody who is also looking at the overall interconnected nature and has kind of the technical aptitude to be looking across all of these things and say, okay, we have these two things that are similar that are on different sides of different sides of stuff, and that we should maybe be trying to connect those as well as part of the series. So I think that, like I said, they're the right questions. I also agree with the earlier comments of, I think it's a little bit hard to pin this down. I think you've done an excellent job in putting these together, but I think, each one of these individual bullet items could probably be a 1 to 2 hour meeting where we discuss the details and the weeds and get down into some of the weeds of, okay, what are the rules here? Is it to different areas? Is it to the IETF LLC? Is it wherever? And I think that there's value in there being talking about some of these qualities here at the end. I think there's value in the person having some technical experience. I think there's value in them understanding how the protocols are being used that we're defining here. And I think that there's value in the tools that we're using to have a very low low friction or low drag coefficient to interact with them. Trying to use XML to RFC can be a little bit daunting to somebody who's brand new to this. And so trying to make sure that, the tools are very, user intuitive, I think would also be helpful here. But I think that these are also sort of general thoughts that I have about it. And I think we need to figure out if that's the overall consensus here, or if, we're all kind of just sitting back and waiting for fireworks as well. I think there's some of that as well.
So thanks, Jared. Before we go to Mike, who I think is next in the queue, I just want to note the conversation that's gone on a little bit on the chat, right? Because that's a valid viewpoint, which is these might be great questions, but maybe these are questions that the RSC, his or herself should manage the answer, bring the community along in terms of managing the answers to these. Is that a view? I think that's what Jay and Adrian are saying, and I'd invite you to comment further if I'm misunderstanding your point, or even if I'm not, if you want to comment, you're more than welcome. Before we continue.
So I'll jump in, and no, I'm not putting forward a view because I don't have a view, obviously, in my role, but I am asking the question as to why, given that is part of the role of the current RSC, that is not expected to, part of the current role of the RSC, that is not expected to continue. Where is the reasoning for saying that needs to be taken away from that role and worked through a separate process? And the second point is that, which I didn't write, is that if that is correct, that it is part of the RSE role and should stay that, is not the question then, has that happened before? And if it hasn't happened, what were the constraints that prevented that happening? And is it the focus for this group to address those constraints?
Okay, I just lost you on the last bit as to what you meant by that, the object there, the pronoun, if you will.
Sorry, so if it has been expected that the RSE should have been delivering this, the process for developing consensus versions of policies, but that process has not happened, then could this group be looking at why that has not happened, what the constraints were, and trying to unblock those constraints so that this can continue as it should do?
I mean, one way to read what you said is that the person who should lead the charge in terms of updating the RSC series governing documents is the RSC themselves, though the result is meant to be a consensus document, if I understand it correctly. I'm just giving you an example as to how that would proceed. Mike, I thank you for your patience.
No worries. Yeah, you were asking about the questions, and I think right now the only real question, the question that's more important than any of the other ones is, what do we want from the series? I'm thinking that what we've got is we've got a large number of blind men standing around a large number of elephants, and some of the elephants aren't even elephants. And it would be useful, I think once you have a better idea of what you want out of the series, especially short, medium, and long term, we can then figure out what we want out of our RSC and whether or not the RSC is a developer for the series, a development agent for the series, or is basically just executing a set of tasks that we've laid out for them. Going back to Jay's question about can we leave this until later? So I think I think if we basically spend our early times just working on that first question, we will probably use up a lot of our our time and maybe actually make some progress.
And you the one that I'm highlighting now.
That's correct.
Okay.
I think that sort of informs everything else downstream of it, including what we want out of the RFC editor.
Okay. Let me ask this question. Do people agree with Mike on that point? Would somebody like to speak either in favor or against on that point? I can see the point. Let me turn it around, Mike, and ask, do you think you could put some words together on the list? I'm not asking you to do this on the spot, but on the list in the next couple of days as to what you want from the series.
Sure.
All right, so we got an outcome already from this meeting. Look at that. John?
You've got an assignment from this playing, not necessarily an outcome yet.
Well, let's hope. John, you wanted to get a word in. Levine.
Hi there. Yeah, I guess I'm sort of agreeing with Mike, but saying it even more strongly, which is, I mean, there's some sort of basic facts to me that seem to be fairly obvious. Like the RFC series is only interesting to the world insofar as it publishes standards that people want to use. And I think we all agree that as a that in its current form, it doesn't do that very well. You know, if somebody said, well, what do I need to read to write a DNS server or a mail client? Like, I couldn't tell them. You know, it's dozens of documents and it's errata and it's this and it's that. You know, and while I think the continuously updated living document model is a pretty bad one. I mean, I think the idea that that our 50-year-old model of documents that are published once and never updated, and that it's somebody else's problem to figure out what's related to what, isn't working very well now. And until we can come to grips with that issue, then we can't really tell the RFC editor what he or she is supposed to do. I mean, I can just tell you the stuff I'm doing now is really low level. It's like, are the fonts actually legible? Should there be a subheader operator for stuff like that? And somebody needs to worry about that. But this is about 14 levels higher up, and I think it might even be like a level up from what you're chartered to talk about.
We have a little bit of a free hand if we, if we want, on this. I can go back to the IAB if we feel like we need more authority, but to have that conversation. But let me ask you the same question I asked Mike about putting out your own view on that in terms of what you want from the series on the list. I realize it's a little tricky when you're the, the stand-in, if you will, but, and if you don't feel comfortable, I think everybody would understand, but would you?
Well, given that I plan, at some point there will be a call for a full-time RSC, and I do not plan to volunteer. So that given that my current position is everybody understands, I'm treading water, and when I'm done, I'm going to get out of the pool. Yeah, then I think I can write something up.
That'd be great. Okay, let's see here. Alternatively, we can call him Six-Man Working Group or Bob Hendon.
Mute. Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know how to fix that in WebEx. Since I have a login for my working group role, WebEx seems to want to use that all the time. It's very annoying. So I'm not speaking for the six-man working group.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm sort of agreeing with that. It seems like a lot of this stuff is what we want the RFC editor to do. And when I think about, we have all these documents that describe that role, I sort of wonder if instead of trying to do this all from whole cloth, we should go and be looking at least what it, currently says. And because a lot of effort went into that over a long time, and I don't think things have changed so much. My other comment is, it seems like what we're not talking about, and I think we should, is the reason we're having this discussion is because of the set of events that occurred that caused us to not, that, to have Heather resign. And I think we need to also be talking about how, and I think this is perhaps even more important than the, what the job, well, it's related to the job, but it's also, so how do we provide management and oversight of this role or person? Because we clearly had a disaster with the current model. And so I don't think, the thing about doing the same thing over again and expecting a different result, I think applies here. And so I think we do need to be talking about how, if we want someone to represent the series and work with the community to define its evolution, and I think John's issues are very good. I think we're going to need to figure out how we're going to provide oversight and management of that role, because what we did last year was obviously a giant problem.
Well, you're going to probably think I sound like a broken record. On your latter point, Bob, put forward a few words as to where you think we could do things better in terms of the model. Now, maybe not everything about the model was broken, which is, I think, your other point too, or at least something that one could find in your other point. And to your first point about understanding where we're coming from, Mike and John both took action items to describe sort of what they want from the series. So one of the things I'll ask them, think of this in deltas, so that we can understand, let's figure out where we are versus where you want to be. And so, but Bob, could I prevail on you maybe to write a little bit about how you think the situation could be avoided the next time in terms of what can we do better to improve that aspect? Would you like to write a little bit about that?
I will think about it. Yes. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't have, and yeah, I don't. Wanted to make sure I was still unmuted. I don't have in my head what I think is the right answer to this. I just know what we did before didn't work very well, and prefer to not have it repeat. So, but I will think.
And I think everybody would agree with you, by the way. But I think your point is well taken, that we should be conscious of what happened, in such a way that we can see that it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, or at least we get to make different mistakes.
Okay, I think that John Clenson is next.
Yeah, two comments, the latter of which just caught up with me. When it's said that series is only useful if it publishes standards people want to use, I agree with that up to a point. But we've also believed over the years that the RFC series is a record of the evolution of the internet technology and architecture, that it's a record of research, it's a record of independent thinking. This is why we have streams other than the IETF stream, and indeed why the IETF stream has experimental and informational documents. So I understand where the comment is coming from, but I think if we focus on that, we're losing a bunch of important things which we have traditionally thought were important, and we don't lose them by accident. The second observation, completely separate, is that I'm not certain I agree with the statement that what we had before didn't work in its most general form. Having reread the model documents and 4844 in the last 24 hours, I find lots there that I think needs tuning. But I also believe that the thing which failed was a misunderstanding or abuse of the system we have, rather than the documented system being broken. And while I agree it needs to be fixed and clarified, I think losing sight of that distinction is probably a bad idea.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure who you're responding to there on that latter point. I think Bob's point was just that he didn't want to see a repeat. And I don't think anybody disagrees. And the question I asked was, what changes would need to be necessary in order for that to happen? And the answer might be, in order for the repeat to not happen. And the answer might be no structural changes, right? It could be that nobody that they actually like the way the system was designed, but we didn't like the way it was operated, which is perfectly reasonable outcome. I'm not saying that's my position at all, by the way. I'm just saying that's one possible outcome. All right, I'll stop there and say I see Brian would like a word in.
Yeah, so firstly, I want to say, unraveling this backwards, I completely agree with both of John's points. And I also pretty much completely agree with both of Bob Hendon's points. But on the first of Bob Hendon's points, there is a section early in my draft that attempts to gather together the material that I found about what we thought the basic existing principles and objectives of the RFC series are. So I'd be very interested if people can dredge up other material that's in our documentation somewhere that gets to explaining the mission and the principles of the series. Because I suspect that one of our problems is that that's never been properly gathered together. So send text.
Yeah, and so you too, you obviously, Jay?
So this is a question then. Looking at the list of issues that have been raised about the future of the series, this seems to be a very long list, and many of them appear to have been quite long-standing, from what I understand. So my question is, in recent years, did the RSC put together any form of process to attempt to answer those questions and get a resolution for them as per the role requirement that I quoted in the chat earlier? And if not, then what were the constraints that prevented that, and are those things that can now be addressed by this group?
All right. Let me take a stab. Does anybody want to try and answer that before I do?
I might. Jay, the answer to your question partly depends on how much dirty laundry washing you think is helpful for this conversation. One view of what happened was the RSC tried to do that and got pushed back, and then tried to do it again and got pushed back, and then tried to do it a third time and tried to not deal with problems which in her perception had already been settled, and got fired or got put into a position where she felt like she had no choice but to resign. Now, I don't know if the community would agree with that characterization. I don't even know if Heather would agree with that characterization. But going very far down the path, which I think you suggested, takes us into territory about digging up the details of what went wrong, which I don't, and who did it, and I don't think that's helpful.
Yeah, so I agree, and I'll step in and just say the goal isn't to sit here in that. We don't want to go down that particular rabbit hole. I think Jay's question, and tell me if I'm wrong, Jay, is are there structural impediments to an RSC attempting to answer these questions and lead the community in answering these questions, and that I'm not prepared to answer that myself, to be honest.
good way of putting the question.
If one reads the model documents or the discussion out of Montreal a year and a half ago, there are no structural impediments. There may have been some operational impediments.
Okay, we have drained the queue. What I heard from a couple of people as an important next step was that this question needs to be elaborated. So Mike and John graciously agreed after a little prompting for me to share their views. That was John Levine. I want to note that Martin Thompson and Mark Nottingham, I thought, did a pretty good job on list of doing of going in that general direction. So I want to invite other people to answer this question. What do we want from the list? And I'm just going to look, at the list of people who are on the call, right, and say, yeah, I really would like to know, for instance, from Julian, what's your view? And from Doug and from Colin, who is a stream owner, pretty much. What do you want from this series? Right. One of the, in fact, Colin, if I can give you some homework, I know it's late, but if I can give you some homework, one of the historical challenges to the IRTF is that sometimes the RFC series hasn't really fit the model well. Maybe there are things you want that the rest of us IETFers don't think about, right? In terms of things you might need from the series, and particularly things you might think you don't have. And it might be something you might want to also ask your friends on the IRSG. If you want to comment now, I've certainly put you on the spot, as it were. But
you've certainly put me on the spot. Do you mean in terms of, for example, the format of the RFCs, or do you mean in terms of the organization and the way the series is managed? I suspect my answer would be different.
I certainly could see the format, the format questions, but also, how this, if there are issues about how the series are managed, if there are, especially if there are issues about how the series are managed that cause you consternation, I think it'd be good to surface those.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the format, I think it clearly has been limited and has been relaxed, at least somewhat recently. There are certainly changes I might suggest, but I don't think this is the right venue for them. That is something a future RFC should be leading the discussion on, I would suggest.
Okay.
In terms of the how will we phrase? I forget how we were phrasing the previous thing. The process, I guess, I did not have any concerns with the way things were being managed.
Okay. All right. Miriam.
Yes, hello. So without any hats on, I just would like to make a personal comment, and I don't want to interrupt the discussion here, but I do have the feeling that this question about what should the series be is a never-ending question. I didn't say anything in the discussion so far because I really have the feeling that a lot of good points were already made, and I couldn't add anything to it. Everything I could say was said already by somebody else. So I do have the feeling we do start to turn in cycles, and maybe we are approaching the point where we should actually just digest what was said. Everybody has exchanged opinions, and where we should work on proposals and then see how much we disagree there.
Okay, and you're talking about very specific proposals for the RSC. Okay. Okay. Let me take that on board, but I don't want to quite drive there yet, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that was just my personal feeling. I don't want to interrupt the discussion if people really think more discussion needs to happen.
But I do think the point is that we should be careful about spinning in circles. So on this question, we have to come to terms with it, I think, pretty quickly. And so people have views that they think are important to get out, and they think are important to have a shared perspective on in order to answer, say, the rest of these questions. Let's do this. And I said we wouldn't be decisional on this call, and I won't be, but what I'll propose on the list is that we address this question for the next 2 weeks or so. And then let's, if people haven't shared their views by then, we're going to, if they have, then we can start to have a discussion about it. If we can't close on that, then I think we have to try and shift to this other point here and ask for those more specific proposals. I think we have the right questions. And again, I think it helps to think in terms of deltas and also to think in terms of whether it is we who need to answer each of these questions, or whether it's something that the RSC themselves can drive once we have one. Joel.
I've been listening to this last part. I was a little late to the meeting, but I've been listening to this discussion for a bit. And this question that you were focused on, which Mike asked, I think, to be focused on, what do we want from the series, in one sense is critical, and in one sense, for me, is a waste of time question. And the reason it's both is that there appear to be some people who want something very different from the status quo from the series. And if we as a community want something very different from the status quo, then we need to say that. For me, well, one can argue about the exact details. Roughly, I like the RFC series we have. And so saying, what do we want from it? I end up going, well, I suppose there's some words over there and words over there, and it works, man. But not everybody agrees with that perspective, and I understand it. But I don't know. The question I would ask, if one is going to say, you want something different, I'd like to understand why and why you're willing to give up things you don't want. Just saying, I want food. I mean, I want a pony and he wants a unicorn. That's great. And somebody else wants a Pegasus. Fine, that doesn't do us any good. So in some sense, the why you want it, what do you think you're accomplishing by getting it, is almost more important than what is it exactly you want to change?
For those people who took the homework, please include the why. I think that's a good point, Joel. And to keep the time from being too much wasted, let us again put a time limit on how much we're going to spend on this point, especially if it seems that we're going to start spinning. Let's see here, Colin.
Just to follow up on that, we seem to be a little bit confused about whether we're discussing the way the series evolves, or the way we appoint someone or manage whoever it is who decides how the series evolves. I'm not sure I'm phrasing that well, but they seem to be two different topics, and we're conflating the two. And maybe this is part of the difficulty.
Right. I think the point you're making, if I may use a little, is this a question that has to be discussed now? Right? Or is this something that really the RFC editor lead us in over time? And I do think historically, Heather did try to do this, did try to address this point, by the way. This is something that I think she spent a lot of time on. So,
right, and I mean, maybe one of the questions we should be asking is whether the RSC has the authority to evolve the series in terms of the format of documents, for example, or whether that's something other aspects of the community should be driving. But to me, it seems we're focusing a lot on the mechanics of how are the documents processed rather than the process by which we find someone and effectively manage someone to make those decisions.
Okay, so there's a high-level question, right? Which is, and this is something we can bring to the list tomorrow, which we can address, which is, should we spend our time on which of these questions can the RSE work on leading the community, and which of them are beyond the purview of the RSE themselves, right? And including this one here. And that will help us answer that. Does that address your point, Colin?
Yeah, I think so. I just think we need a little bit more clarity on what the problem we're trying to solve is, because we seem to be conflating two different sets of topics.
Okay, and I'm just going to read out, can I read out what Steve, if the RSC doesn't have the authority to lead the discussion on how to evolve the format of the series, the position ought not to exist, really. Well, in the IETF, right, in our environment, usually we allow for that conversation to be led by anybody, actually, don't we? Other comments?
Yeah, this is Brian directly responding to that. I agree with you, but the essential problem we haven't yet solved for the RFC series is we don't know what the community is that is going to form the consensus that the RSC is going to follow.
Absolutely right, Brian.
You want to comment further? Sorry.
No, it's absolutely right. And Heather tried very hard to nail down, is it the IETF? Is it the IRTF? What the streams? With the RFC series is bigger than any of those communities. How do you reach out and touch the operator community and all those things? And so that point Ryan made is obviously unmeasurable.
And yet we have a need to measure at the end of the day. Yeah, I do see that there are people who need to mute. Doug, I'm not sure where the noise is coming from though. Is it Julian? I think maybe Julian. Are you trying to get in or? Okay, Julian's muted. So. So I think that was one of the questions we need to address, which is, and as you said, Russ, it sort of goes to who is the, to who is it's about who the RFC editor has to be accountable to almost, right? Or is it a different thing, right? Is it who the RFC is accountable to? That might be a group of defined people versus who the audience is, which might be a much vaguer issue, which is, I think, where things got hung up. All right, I think we have drained the queue. So I have a couple of actions from this discussion. The first action is, I think, that those who wish to, and I'm hoping that John in particular, should address what we want from the series and make those deltas with a little bit of reasoning as to why, to address Joel's point and also Bob Hinden's point as well. I think the other action that we just took was in order to focus a little bit on which problem we want to solve. Do we want to solve for who gets to lead the community in these sorts of questions? And maybe we might have to go through them individually, right, as to whether they need to be addressed. Again, looking at deltas, who do we think does these things today, versus who we think needs to do them in the future, and then including, this question as to what do we want from the series? Is that something also that the RFC can do? So I will raise that question on. And we're approaching our time. Does anybody else want to cover any additional ground today? All right. Does anybody else have any additional comments? Because I think we're at AOB. Okay. Well, first, I'd like to thank everybody for participating. We had, I think, a pretty good discussion. I think we have a couple of decent action items that will help us focus forward. I realize that the effort has, started off in, a little bit vague. Our charter is pretty wide open, and it helps to hear, different views as to how people want to proceed. And I thought we had some very good defining questions. We have another meeting coming up that is scheduled in 2 weeks. What I'd like to do is see if we can start those discussions about, if we can start the discussions based on whether the RFC has to can take these forward, in which case we can talk about RFC qualities that would allow that person to enable that person to do so. Maybe we can use the meeting 2 weeks from now then to see how far we've gotten and to sort of use it as a waypoint. And I think it's probably good also if people want to work with Brian to help elaborate his document. Brian, I'd like to thank you again for writing it. It was very helpful to help us focus on at least some aspects. It brought good discussion to the list. And with that, any final comments before we adjourn? Okay, before we adjourn, I just want to also add, I'd like to thank the minute takers who were Tim and, or the people who were scribing, who were Tim Wasinski and Neville, both for volunteering. And thanks for everybody to just sort of help make this work. And I'll see you on the list tomorrow. And have a good night and good morning, good afternoon.
Elliot, can you the chat log gets captured?
Yeah, I will take care of that right now.
Thanks very much, because I think there's a lot of useful discussion there.
Okie doke. I'm going to stop sharing and I'll drop this stuff right into your pad. Thanks very much.
Thank you and bye.
Have a very good day.
Bye all.